up in Lothian, so Edinburgh and surrounding areas, and this is Helen, and so we'll be presenting today. Unfortunately, Anne, who's one of the community psychiatric nurses in our team, wasn't able to make it today, so it's just the two of us, so I'm sorry about that. Can everybody hear me as well? I feel completely wired up, but anyway, okay. Right. So for those of you who don't know our surrounding area, we're not just all kind of bagpipes and castles, we do have other areas too. So we've got a kind of a huge variety within Lothian. We've got our city centre of Edinburgh, but then surrounding areas which are a variety of very rural kind of locations. Also some areas of very deprived areas, as highlighted by our train spotting photograph. And I think our overall population is about 800,000, so about 160,000 under 18s is the kind of population that we cover. So in terms of our Tier 4 services, we have an inpatient unit which is based in Edinburgh, which covers the whole of the southeast of Scotland. So that includes Lothian, Fife, which is the area just above us, and the Borders, which is just below us. So that's a 12-bedded unit for 12 to 18-year-olds. And it'll come within the context of what we're talking about. We've had quite major service changes, really about 4 or 5 years ago, where our inpatient unit's very much now an acute service in terms of crisis-based admissions with very short length of stays. And as a result, what we've had to do, or what we've wanted to do, I should say, is really invest in our other Tier 4 community-based services. So now we're in a slightly, I would say, luxurious almost position of having quite an array of different Tier 4 services. So we have our intensive treatment service, which was developed about 4 years ago, and that's the service which I work in, which is a kind of outreach-based service for young people, 0 actually up to 18, but mainly, to be honest, we work with adolescents with a variety of different presentations. I think our biggest referrals for young people with depression and kind of high suicidal intent or attempts, and our second biggest referral is probably anorexia. We've actually got 2 over 12-day programmes, one which is based in Edinburgh city centre and another one which is in kind of one of our slightly kind of more distant locations in West Lothian, and it's a group-based peer programme where young people will come in on a daily basis, and we also have our early psychosis support service, which is for young people who are presenting with psychosis or who are at risk of developing psychosis, which is a service which Helen works for as well. Okay. And finally, we do have an under 12s day service as well, which is mainly used as things like Incredible Years, Dinosaur Schools, kind of the Webster Stratton model. It's young people again kind of coming in on a multiple times a week basis. So in terms of our AMBIT training, I'm trying to remember now, I think it was 4 years ago we had AMBIT training, I can't remember off the top of my head, sorry. But what we did is that we mainly, these 3 teams who are in the centre here were our AMBIT trained teams. And I think that at that point that was probably a slight misinterpretation on our point in terms of thinking of AMBIT as being very much an outreach model. And in retrospect, which would have been really helpful, would have also trained our inpatient unit staff, because what we found is we came back from our AMBIT training with a whole new language, and our inpatient unit staff were saying, what on earth are you talking about when you're talking about so in retrospect that would have been really helpful, and what we've done since then is we've had quite a lot of training events, which is just kind of AMBIT informed training really to bring our inpatient staff and some of our Tier 3 colleagues up to speed. So in terms of our kind of mentalisation kind of components of our service, we do provide MBT for adolescents, so we have, I think it's 4 clinicians who are trained in MBT for adolescents, and we've got an MBT group, which is a kind of structured 8-week group, 12-week, which we're just in the process of finishing a manual for, which feels great, so that will hopefully be out for everybody to use fairly soon. We've obviously then got kind of our AMBIT trained teams, which is the teams that I just talked about previously, and then we've got more AMBIT aware teams, which is things like our inpatient unit and also our Tier 3 services. And this is really just kind of representing in terms of some of our experiences, which is what we find is that when young people are most likely to need help, they're least likely to actually receive it. And so, I mean, we know, for example, that half of adult mental health difficulties are developed by the time a young person is 14. And we also know that young people really struggle to represent themselves, I suppose, to kind of statutory NHS organisations. And so And also we know that unfortunately the dropout rates, particularly for kind of NHS CAMHS services, are actually quite high. I think you said it was between kind of 25 to 75% that are dropping out. So there's something in terms of the services that we're providing as NHS which aren't really suiting the needs of the population which we need to target, who are the highest risk of developing adult mental health difficulties. Okay, I'll pass over to Helen for the next bit, for the stats.
Thank you.
Right,
completely incoherent. This is, like I say, a very nerdy academic slide, but I think represents a bit of where we come from. We work very closely with Matthias Schwenauer at the University of Edinburgh and Andrew Gumley over in Glasgow, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about psychosis because that's the team that I worked in, but we've been heavily influenced by this set of data coming out of this particular research team. And what they've done there over a number of years is really build up a picture of I think what John was touching on earlier, that many young people find making secure attachments extremely threatening and overwhelming, and this is very much linked to some of the reasons why they disengage from services. So certainly in the first episode study, we're finding very much that dismissing attachment styles are massively highly overrepresented in this early psychosis group. We built up this really nice picture of service engagement, developmental difficulties, attachment style, mentalisation difficulties, and the converse. So if you have the ability to understand other people's minds, then you're much more likely to engage in help-seeking behaviour. And in particular, we've begun to see that mentalisation or mental state processing actually predicts your outcome over 12 years. So that's kind of the academic perspective that we're coming from as well, and why in particular we're focusing on engagement in some of the data that we're presenting to you now. And quite like this slide, which is actually a cartoon about health insurance, but it's the catch-22. So it says here, you're covered for the treatment as long as you don't need the treatment. Once you need the treatment, you're no longer covered. And I think that's actually quite a nice metaphor for mentalisation, actually. If you can actually engage and have the capacity to mentalise, then maybe you actually don't need it as much as other people. And I think that takes us on to why we're so interested in both engagement but also AMBIT, because the onus is on us to begin trying to sustain and develop that mentalising capacity in the young people. And when I looked on the AMBIT manual earlier this week, there's 101 entries about engagement, so clearly it's a subject that touches us all. There's a bit of data inspired by Peter's article earlier this year, Peter and Dickon, but also because we promised it 3 or 4 years ago, and we've been tearing our hair out ever since, trying desperately to keep our promise. So it's not quite the original plan, because these things never really work out that way, but we have been able to ask a number of questions. So I'll show you a tiny bit of data, but also I think we want to reflect on how we're using that data to try and sustain some practice within the team. So this particular data, dirty data from the service, but also some of the ideas that have come from the wider research, and particularly from Matthias's stuff from the first episode study. So we wanted to know, is our team actually making a difference? We were really interested, because of our focus on engagement, what's the pattern of service usage? And then is there a relationship between the two? I think some people might actually ask, should engagement in itself be an outcome? But we very much wanted to look at whether it was linked. And also, if there are some who are less likely to engage, then who are they? Can we tell up front so that we can gear our services to target those particular young people? So data collection, nightmare. Abby Noble's an assistant who does a bit of work with us, and I forgot to take a picture of her, but this is what she looked at for most. Don't tell her that, it's on video, she's going to kill me. Oops, keep going the wrong way. That is the missing link. On the basis of my previous job, an IT person, we had about 10 years worth of data from the stuff that you have to enter, service related data, and after about 2 years of meetings he finally came and said to me, I can't find the missing link. So we lost pretty much all that service related data. So this time, thanks to Abby's efforts, we've managed to at least rescue some of it. By no means all that we set out to find, but we have got some that we've managed to link up. So in terms of what we have, like I say, a lot of it is service use data, so just basic stuff like clinicians' names, dates of appointment, why they came, etc., etc. So really, really basic stuff. We'd hope to do all sorts of fancy things to try and measure intensity and frequency between appointments, but that was a step beyond us if we were ever to produce anything meaningful. And we also did a sort of calculation about how well the young people are engaged, and you do have to remember this is a help-seeking population who are well engaged in the first place. So they've had to come usually through a GP referral, usually through Tier 4. There's a lot of hoops that they have to jump through, and we're very aware of that in the service, that's maybe not ideal, but I suspect that many of our NHS colleagues will recognise that kind of service model. So we had that data, and you'll see there that those who came beyond assessment for treatment, we had data for about 212. Then we've also tried to do a bit of clinical outcomes data, and there's variable, well, the different teams around Lothian they're in different stages of collecting data. So it's hugely variable, and quite worryingly, the amount of clinical outcomes data that actually matches up with the service users data is far from ideal, shall we say. So you will see that as we go through some of the data, we go down to really, really tiny numbers at the end, and some of that, of course, reflects as not collecting data well, and collecting lots of admission data but not discharge, all the usual stuff. So it's dirty data, but we have got some. The HUQuals, the quality of life, which all the teams use. The Beck Youth Inventories are more the over 12s day programme, and the ITS use whatever aspect is relevant. And in EPS we use BDI and the PANS. This is the spread: 1/3 male, 2/3 female, average age of around 16. Most are seen within the ITS in that alternative to admission pathway, so 58%, we see about 18, and so on. This is what we find. That how long are they spending in the service? Well, a median of 233 days. About 1/3 do have an inpatient admission, and I really do think this reflects just how unwell this particular group of young people actually are, and that has held steady actually over a previous EPS audit, the early psychosis audit, a previous ITS audit. So we always seem to have this figure of around about 1/3 being admitted for, again, median duration of 28 days. In red are flagged up the mean number of professionals involved, because this relates to the question that we want to ask you at the end, just thinking about, well, are we really providing a team around the worker rather than the young person type model? I think there's reasons why the service has been set up in this way, and in particular in Scotland, rather than having IAPT, we have lots and lots of training going on at government level, filtering down into the health boards, that really focuses on training people up and accrediting them in specific therapies and approaches. So we really do have a model where people are sort of coming in and offering an intervention to the young people, rather than all the efforts being focused on that key worker relationship. And I think there's pros and cons about that, which hopefully will help us think about that. It is a relatively well engaged group, as you can see down the bottom. And to a certain extent, I suspect that's self-selecting. I'm not going into detail about this, but yes, the young people do get better. Hooray! Which is very good news, but particularly on the quality of life and some of the more negative symptoms and in the PANS. Anyone who wants to can look at that in more detail later on. I mean, you will see there's big numbers for the admission data, much lower numbers for the discharge, but we are able to show an effect. I'll come back to the Beck depression in EPS on the last slide, because there's a story to tell quickly about that. Impact of engagement. What we found really interestingly was that young people who are less well engaged spent much longer in the service, had more people involved in their care, and did spend quite proportionately more time in, or had more inpatient admissions, although it wasn't significant. And I think, I think part of this more people involved is part of what we call sort of the relapse dance, or trying to prevent that. So people who aren't securely attached don't come forward for help at crisis, so then you're more likely to get a whole pile of people coming in to deal with that crisis, and then that gives them a really bad experience of services for the next time round. So that's my hypothesis, but I think there's also probably many other reasons going on there. Though quickly what we found was that at baseline, so when they came into the service, once we'd split an engaged and a less well engaged group, they didn't really differ at all on the clinical measures, apart from quality of life, physical and environment. Surprisingly, they didn't differ on social deprivation, category or gender, but they did differ on age, with the younger group being better engaged, and I suspect that's to do with the social support and families bringing them in rather than young people making their own way in. We also looked at whether they were engaged actually made an impact on their outcomes. The numbers are tiny by the time we get to this stage, particularly in the difficult to engage group, not surprisingly, but we did find an effect across all the quality of life scores. So it didn't make a difference to their clinical, to emotional distress or the PANS, but it did make a difference on quality of life, which very much fits with the model that we do have, the recovery focus. So we were quite, let's say, small numbers, but we were pleased with that. So that's the summary. Young people do get better. Those who are not well as engaged receive more intensive intervention. I'm not quite sure if that's the right way to put it. You can reflect on that later. Those who weren't as well engaged differed on quality of life, were older, and engagement did appear to influence quality of life at discharge. 3 more slides where we're just going to talk a little bit about sustaining good practice. You're going to do this bit.
I think we were just thinking about some of the problems we've run into in terms of sustaining practice. I think what we have noticed is that we had our training 4 years ago, and since then numbers of members of staff have changed in our teams, and that's a huge problem that we have, is actually being able to sustain enough people who actually have knowledge of AMBIT principles to keep it alive within teams. But what we have found is that what people have taken on is a lot of the AMBIT language. So we'll still frequently have people saying to us, Fiona, can I have an AMBIT moment with you? And that's really good to hear, do you know what I mean, in terms of that common language, and that does seem to spread within the service. What we've therefore relied a little bit on is our AMBIT champions or leads, which is we've got 2 within each of our services, each of our teams who are trained. And what we've developed is kind of I'm not sure, this is probably illegal, but anyway, we've developed a kind of internal training model where where our new staff, is myself and Gavin, who's one of our charge nurses, have been training up new staff, and also, as I said earlier, our inpatient unit staff in what AMBIT is. We do AMBIT refreshers. We're just about to do an AMBIT masterclass for all our AMBIT leads again, just to remind them and to update them on all the changes which have happened in the manual, because it has changed quite drastically in the past 4 years. And also just AMBIT awareness for our Tier 3 colleagues as well, and so hopefully we're going to have another one planned later in the year for that. What we've not got around to doing, but what we're going to do is we're going to actually put staff induction for the different teams into the AMBIT manual, which means that in order to actually be able to be inducted, they've got to go into the AMBIT manual. Okay, so that's a long-term plan, but for the time being, what we do have to do is make it absolutely statutory that everybody has some kind of AMBIT induction when they come into Tier 4. And what we found really helpful is, I think currently we're the only team which is trained up in Scotland, and we sometimes feel a little bit far removed. And so I think what we've found really helpful is attending things like these AMBIT conferences. We found the video conferencing that we did really helpful in terms of just being able to grasp the new concepts and the new language which is coming out, and be able to take that back to our team. And I think that's the things that I think we're most worried about, is how do we keep these connections. So I'll pass over to you the rest.
Just going back to the data, also thinking about how we can sustain good practice through the data. So some of the ideas that we use, particularly in EPS, when we do outcome data, there's actually more measures than we use, than we showed you. And what we do is just do an A4 summary and actually use that with the young person at formulation meetings, at review meetings, so that there's an immediate effect with the staff constantly using that information to feed into what we're doing. And we really do find that certainly in EPS, it challenges many assumptions that we still all hold about sort of professional pessimism. So we actually do see that at least some of our young people, many of our young people are recovering and making progress, and that in itself is worth its weight in gold. We also spend, and have done for many years, spent an awful lot of time just formulating why young people aren't engaging, and that comes originally, I guess, from the first episode study, but this is very much reinforcing our need to keep on doing that. I think we don't use the AIM at the moment, but we are really making an effort to do goal-based care plans in some form or other, and just keep going back to them, keeping the focus on that recovery. And again, I think that all comes out of our reflections on what we're showing to you today. And we haven't done this yet. This is very not AMBIT that we're showing you the data here before we've actually shown the teams, but there's nothing like a conference to make you put some data together. But we will be doing that. We have tier 4 good practice days, and each of the teams individually have away days, so we will take this data back. I think for me, some of the things that have most jumped out are about the need to really identify, even within our help-seeking group, those least likely to engage, thinking about things like mentalisation and attachment in the team, and also just really putting in place social support. So if young people haven't got that there and available, we need to scaffold that, scaffold the positive relationships coming. Even if we do have to bring them in to see us for an appointment, they can't do that alone. They won't. So I know I'm going over 2 more seconds. Depression in first episode psychosis, that has been a problem since we did an audit in 2011, just before AMBIT trained, so it was quite depressing to see that those things still aren't shifted, because we put in a whole number of strategies around social support, around running a depression group, around really focusing on that in our formulation. So that's something that we really need to go back and think about in the team, because we're seeing that there is still no shift over the course of treatment, and we're not quite sure at the moment why that's the case. And like I say, our question to you is about these thoughts around the number of professionals involved. This is just the mental health bit, so they all have other agencies involved. So there's an enormous amount of people involved in these young people's care. So we'd very much like you to help us. How could or should we be moving more towards a team around the key worker approach, and what are your reflections on that? So sorry for overrunning slightly, but thank you.